Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for participating in today's, especially our plenary session. Welcome to the AI-generated visual misinformation, propaganda, and democracy panel. My name is Mona Kasra. I am the Associate Professor of Digital Media Design here at UVA and one of the faculty leads for the Digital Technology and Democracy Lab here at the Karsh Institute. And the Digital Technology and Democracy Lab, I have my notes here so that I just get all the information correct here, is a collaboration across UVA and explores the intersections of digital technology and democracy. And I want to really especially thank the lab's director, Laurent Dubois, and the entire staff at the Karsh Institute for really facilitating and embracing and supporting this event, which is part of a two-day convening that is happening right now with a variety of participants that we have here on this topic. They're leading voices on this topic. So thank you, Laurent, and thank you, Karsh Institute, for this. Before we begin, I also want to let you know about a couple of events that are coming up at the lab. Thursday, October 3rd, which is next week, on Thursday at 5 p.m., we're going to have an open house in our lab, which is above the Cardinal Hall. So we would love to see as many of you who are interested to learn about, what the lab is doing. We have postdocs and the faculty leads. So please join us. That's next week. At noon, both Wednesday, October 23rd, and Friday, actually that's Thursday, October 23rd, isn't it? Okay, my notes were wrong, but so Thursday, October 23rd, and Friday, October 24th, one of the faculty leads at the lab, Jasreya, will host two presentations on reimagining AI for environmental justice and creativity. And those are also, and they're happening here, so please, if you're interested, please join. And if you want to be informed about the lab's event, please see the clipboard that's outside, and you can sign your email and you receive the announcements about the lab. Back to our panel. So in our current digital age, the issue of misinformation and misleading content and propaganda has become increasingly prevalent, and these type of misleading content are basically spreading sometimes like wildfire. And images, they're very powerful in the way, they're very powerful for communication, and especially in the way we perceive the world, and we, make our even decisions sometimes. And the past couple of years, especially, these advancement in generated media content and deep fake have made these creation of the misleading content, it took it to a whole new level. The tools are becoming a lot more accessible, easier to use, and the ability to make some of these content, especially for bad actors, is obviously has grown. So the questions that are raised here are basically like, what are the impacts of these images? What is the impact, especially on our democracy, right? And is it a threat to our democracy? And also, what are the potential consequences, and what are the possible solutions for this issue, perhaps? So we have three wonderful leaders and with fantastic work in this area. I'm going to read and introduce them, their brief bios, and then we will hear from them. So we have Sam Woolley. Thank you, Sam, for being here. Sam is a leading expert on computational propaganda. His well-known research explores how automation and artificial intelligence and user armies control information flow during especially pivotal events. He's an award-winning author and has published 4 books and numerous articles and essays on propaganda, disinformation, and emerging technologies. And he also, Sam's writes extensively for the New York Times, The Guardian, Wired, Atlantic, TechCrunch, all of them. Sam is an endowed chair in disinformation studies and an associate professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Pittsburgh. Renée DiResta, thank you, Renée, is a social media researcher and author. She studies adversarial abuse online, ways that people attempt to manipulate, harass, or target others on digital platforms. From 2019 to 2013, she was a technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. It's a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technologies. Renée has advised Congress, the executive branch, and academic, civic, and business organizations on issues related to technology and policy, and she's also a contributor at The Atlantic. And last but not least, Santiago Lyon is a head of advocacy and education for Adobe's Content Initiative, Content Authenticity Initiative, which is an association that works to combat misinformation through digital content provenance. Santiago is an award-winning photojournalist and media executive and has won multiple photojournalism awards for his work, decades of work as a conflict photographer. And he was VP and Director of Photography at Associated Press from 2003 to 2016, is that correct? And during which AP received three Pulitzer Prizes for photography. And he has he's done several fellowships at Harvard and at Columbia University. In 2013, he served as a chair of the jury of the World Press Photo Contest. And now he currently serves on the board of Eddie Adams Workshop and the advisory board of Seven Foundation. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful panelists. Thank you for being here. I'm going to pass this to Sam, so please take the stage. Thank you.
Is there a clicker for the slides?
Who has the clicker? Yeah.
I thought we all individually got this one.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mona. Thank you all for having us. This is fantastic. I'm really glad that you all are here to talk with us about this problem. I know it's a problem that's sort of at the peak of consciousness right now, given the election that's going on in this country and elections that have been going on around the year. As The Economist said, this is the year with the most democratic elections ever occurring in history. So important stuff, right? Today, I'm going to be talking to you about something that's been looming large in my mind, which is, does this stuff actually affect us? Does AI-generated imagery, does AI-generated propaganda, does propaganda on social media affect the vote? Does it affect our elections? Does it affect our opinions? You might be thinking, of course, and you and I would probably be in agreement there, but many academics argue otherwise. And I want to talk about why that is. And I want to just do a little bit of a walkthrough of some of the recent reporting that we've seen on these issues and sort of talk to you about like my perspective on it and also argue against some of the arguments we've seen in the press lately. So the first thing we're going to do is look at some recent work on AI's impact on politics and political processes. I'm just going to show you some headlines that we've seen. We'll talk about measuring AI's effect, and if you know social science, you know that social scientists love to measure. They love to talk about behavioral impact. They love to talk about statistics. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why sometimes that creates challenges in terms of our understanding about the impact of technologies upon public opinion. Then I'm going to talk about majority world impacts, and when I say majority world, I mean the rest of the world that's not the United States and the West and Europe, and the way that they use AI, and how they're often used as a petri dish for testing of these kinds of technologies in political contexts. And then we'll talk a bit about regulatory consequences. So first, there's been a lot of positive very negative articles that have been out there. If you're familiar with Tristan Harris and the people that did the Netflix movie on Cambridge Analytica and social media manipulation and those kinds of things, they've come out now talking a lot about how AI is going to be the new social nuclear weapon, these kinds of things. You all know Harari, you might have read *Sapiens*. His new book is about how AI could threaten democracy and divide the world, right? And Brennan Center for Justice, which is quite a steady organization, has talked about the risks and mapped them out. And Reuters has reported on the way in which AI is also a threat to democracy. It's everywhere, right? Like, it's everywhere. But it was everywhere so much that you had a backlash against it. And this backlash is going on as we speak. The Turing Institute in the UK just put out another paper saying that of all the elections in Europe, they were not able to really measure much impact of AI, generative AI specifically, upon these elections. You had some authors that wrote a piece for MIT Tech Review and an earlier piece for Harvard's Misinformation Review saying that AI's impact on elections is overblown and talking through why they thought that was. And then you said that The Economist also talking about the ways in which, maybe you shouldn't be so worried, actually. This isn't so much to worry about. And what I want to argue to you today is that when you see these kinds of headlines, when you see this kind of stuff, I think it's important to step back and understand that the context of these kinds of studies, despite what might be reported in the press or in op-eds, is often a controlled environment. It's often an experimental environment. It's oftentimes a limited amount of data that is able to be gathered from a social media site. In today's world, it is very, very difficult to measure effect through our existing communication infrastructure. Back in the day, if you wanted to measure the impact of, TV, it's a one-to-many medium. There's one place to get that data, and it was much easier to potentially measure effect. Today, with the internet, we have a many-to-many media ecosystem. It is incredibly difficult to isolate the right data set and to do the right kind of work in order to say, when that person saw that deep fake online, it affected their vote. So they voted for Trump or they voted for Biden because of that deep fake. As you know, and my perspective on this probably agrees with maybe what some of you think, is that propaganda and the impact of disinformation and all of this stuff is all around us all the time. It's not because we see one specific video or look at one image or see one bit of text that we change our opinion on a topic. It's because of our whole identity. It's because of the ambient nature of advertising all around us all the time. And I think social scientists, and many of them well-meaning, have a tendency to overstate the lack of impact in a given study to the whole world. They tend to generalize. That's what they want to do. And not everyone does this. I think that it results from, a little bit of overstating the impact of the research that you're doing. And it's understandable in some ways because the amount of data that we get from social media companies is just shrinking. We used to get much more. We went through a period where they were sharing content with academics like us, and then suddenly they've sort of stopped and reneged, and largely led by some of the what's happened at X and other platforms. We no longer really have access. So if you don't have access to the data, how do you actually analyze the impact of the data? Across the rest of the world, were you to go to India, which my team has, were you to go to Myanmar or to go to Turkey, where I've spent a lot of time doing research, if you talk to people, especially, say, female journalists or democratic activists, they will tell you what the impacts of a deep fake can be upon someone's life. Sure, it's not the same as a measured effect in a social scientific study. And it's not, but it is a real world context. For instance, in India, where BJP spread deepfake videos alleging that Muslims have committed violence against women, have led to lynchings of people, led to people being killed. And so there absolutely is an impact. And what I want you to know is that in the majority world, there is an understanding of the fact that Google, or Alphabet I should say, and Meta oftentimes test their tools upon these populations in ways that they wouldn't otherwise do in their own backyard in the United States and in Europe. I won't go too in depth here, but what I will say is that what that means is that oftentimes the kinds of things that we see bearing out in terms of propaganda and over technology in the majority world are a bellwether for what we will likely see in our space here in the United States later on. And so what's going on right now in India, in Brazil, in Myanmar, in Turkey, is quite significant and quite worrisome. I don't know if any of you saw it, but in Indonesia, for instance, they resuscitated a formerly dead dictator to endorse one of the campaigns. These sorts of things are quite wild and have genuine impact upon people's lives. The last thing I want to say, and perhaps the most important thing, is that in my research I talk a lot to people at Facebook and platforms like Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. And they've been very candid with me, which is that when studies like the ones from the Turing Institute come out, they get circulated at these platforms. I have a friend that works at TikTok and that said to me, you know, these things get used as evidence that we should do nothing in terms of content moderation, because they show that they say that there's no impact of our technologies or upon misuse of our technologies upon real people. And so the people behind the scenes who are in charge of self-regulation of the platforms are like, well, why would we get rid of disinformation or about voting or whatever if we don't actually have an impact? And they point to these sorts of things when they get subpoenaed before Congress, and it has a lot of cachet for them. And so as academics, as researchers, as people concerned with this sort of stuff, we have to be very careful about how we speak about these kinds of things, because despite the best of intentions, oftentimes this kind of work ends up getting used against society for the ill of society. If you're interested in this stuff and you want to read more, I had a book come out last year, which is called Manufacturing Consensus, which, as the title suggests, builds on Noam Chomsky's work on propaganda, and it talks about the ways in which propaganda has been developed in the digital age, and goes through kind of a lot of the ideas I've been talking to you about today. But basically the main premise of the book is that Twitter or X and Facebook and Instagram might be presented to us as if they are an open marketplace of ideas, that they are a place where free speech occurs and the best ideas rise to the top. I think that that's BS. I think that these are, based upon my research, that these platforms are fundamentally gameable, especially if you have a lot of resources. And so someone like Elon Musk, in my opinion, presents the illusion of a free speech environment, when in fact what actually ends up happening is that people with lots of money, lots of time, lots of resources are able to game algorithms for their own benefit if they know how. And that's at the heart of the work on computational propaganda. So I hope you take a look. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So when you're here, either one would work. But
Hello, hello. Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
but
No
when
need
you
to
see-
just keep it on as like an extra earring. All right. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about some different applications of generative AI. Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. It's just
No worries.
here. We'll start here.
Perfect.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I've done over the last couple of years. So I was until June at Stanford Internet Observatory. We study adversarial abuse online. And so for us, we're not only looking at propaganda and influence, so that comes up quite a bit. We also look at the field of trust and safety, which is the platform term for the kinds of issues that directly impact users. So that might be child safety, that might be brigading and harassment. There's a whole bunch of different topics that kind of fall into that. And so this is one of the reasons why we've done this work, and why I've been a little bit frustrated about the conversation, much as Sam has been, I think, though maybe from a different standpoint, is that there are very demonstrable harms that are happening that are wholly outside of the realm of propaganda and elections, and they are not being taken as seriously because this question of, is it impacting politics? Can I write my counterintuitive take about politics? Is what's really shaping the conversation. So just as a content warning, I do reference non-consensual intimate imagery in here, and I do reference child sexual abuse materials. There are no visuals, but just as a topical note, I want to mention that. So one of the ways that we thought about the rise of generative AI at SIO was this phrase that I started writing in a couple papers as we were looking at what was happening to a communication ecosystem as new technologies change the playing field. So when you study adversarial actors, what you assume is that anytime there is an addition to the ecosystem in the form of a new platform or a shift in capacity as a result of a new technology, your adversarial actors will change their behavior. They have the capacity to do new things, and they're going to use it. So when you look at the evolution of propaganda or adversarial abuse, even in the context of social media, one of the things that happens is it takes the cost of content distribution to zero. Anybody can propagate a message that leads to a whole bunch of new entrants into the marketplace, and that leads to a whole bunch of different, kind of harms and challenges that we talk about in the context of social media. So generative AI has a very similar thing that happens. It takes the cost of content creation to zero. So not only can you now distribute whatever it is that you want to distribute, and again, this refers to actors of all types, ranging from activists to spammers to state propagandists, but now you can also create very plausible content. You can manufacture unreality, and that's a really interesting adversarial shift. So in a paper that I wrote with a colleague back in early 2023, we were looking at what large language models were going to do. How was text-based generative content going to change the playing field? When you look at an adversarial campaign, you're doing an analysis along three different, a rubric of three different things. You're looking at actors, behaviors, and content. The actor is who is running the operation, the behavior is what can they do, what are they doing, and then the content is what it sounds like, what is the material that's put out there in the world. So when we looked at large language models, funny enough, we wrote this paper with OpenAI, and we actually paused it because they released ChatGPT as we were waiting to release, and I was like, well, now we have to change the tenses in the entire damn paper because we're going from saying when this is democratized, this will happen to you guys just democratized this essentially instantaneously. This is now the present. This is no longer even in the near future. So what we talk about in this, and you can see in this table, is just the novel tactics that emerge when you take costs down to zero. You see a whole rise of new actor type or established actor types beginning to behave in different ways. So this is an image. Show of hands, how many people are aware of what this is? Okay, it's funny how like the morning session of academia, like 6 of us use the same image. This was an image that went viral. It purportedly shows a explosion at the Pentagon. If you spend more than 3 seconds looking at this, if you've ever seen the United States Pentagon, you know that this is not the Pentagon at all. It doesn't look like that. The laws of physics mean that pillars don't work in that way, nor defense posts. But nonetheless, this image went viral on social media briefly because an account that had Bloomberg in the name was made to tweet it. This was when Elon Musk was, he had sort of eliminated verification. And so all the kind of stuff that went viral happened in part because people were piggybacking on established brands. You actually did see a blip in the stock market as there was this moment when people thought that this had happened. So when we talk about political propaganda, we are seeing impact in certain types of ways. But we're seeing much more impact, much more, I would argue, sustained and serious impact, not in the realm of what's happening in politics quite so much, though Sam and I might disagree on that, but in the context of spammers and scammers, what's become possible for them, and then in the context of, this is the title there, generative machine learning is ML, and CSAM is child sexual abuse materials. So what happens when the worst types of people on the internet can now generate content themselves? And the kinds of content that they can generate very significantly shift. And so some of the work that we did was looking at, was beginning to investigate what was happening in content that targets women and children in particular. Which, again, as Sam alluded to, sometimes that bleeds into the political realm as female politicians are targeted with this type of content creation. Sometimes it's happening, unfortunately, fairly frequently it's happening to ordinary people, to women who do not have the megaphone that would come with being a public figure or a politician, where you can say, no, that's not really me. So a lot of the harm that's happening is to people who are essentially, who do not have the capacity to correct the record or speak out against what's happening to them. And then on the spam and scams front, a lot of what we were looking at was just ways in which people were trying to separate people from their hard-earned money. We're trying to manipulate elderly people. We're trying to scam people, and we're using generative AI to do it. So just these two, again, very different shifts in the trust and safety realm, actor behavior shifting in response to a new technology being democratized. So just kind of a quick walk through this. In the context of spam, some of what we were looking at, spammers are always, they're incredibly early adopters. And so if you're trying to figure out like what political actors might do, you actually kind of can look to spammers first, and that's because they care about money, because they are always trying to find means of exploitation that platforms have not figured out how to take action against yet. They are incredibly resourceful, and one of the first things that we saw in around December of 2023, I started the study because this stuff started showing up in my feed constantly. And there was just this interesting dynamic by which platform recommender systems were boosting this kind of content to people. And so ordinary people were being sort of misled into engaging. Once you engaged, you would see the spammers really trying to grow audiences to get people to follow, pushing out more content, very high volume content. And this kind of content was receiving millions of engagements. This was not small, this was actually quite big. And so it was very interesting because even as the conversation, even as we were not seeing a ton of activity happening in the political realm, even as those were very isolated incidents, this proliferation was beginning to happen on Facebook and the bottom fat cat there. If you've been on TikTok, you might have encountered this. It comes with a soundtrack of meows. And so that is, it's very weird, it gets tens of millions of views. Scams is where you start to see the content being deployed to make people either spend money or take an action. That's an image. I pulled that from Reddit actually the other day. There's some really great groups on Reddit that actually just like are ordinary people sharing the scams that they encounter, that they see their elderly relatives sharing, to try to create responses among the community where people will go say, this isn't a real product. You can't really buy this. This page is trying to scam you. Because they'll tell you that you can buy that cat chair for $2,000, right? Which of course doesn't exist. You're starting to see in the realm of audio that same kind of hoax is being used. They will play a couple seconds. It sounds like a person that you know has been kidnapped. They will tell you you can't get off the phone. They'll hurt the loved one if you get off the phone, and they try to make you send them money or send them Bitcoin. So that's a dynamic that's happening. Again, the one on the bottom was a very high-profile one. This office worker in Hong Kong wound up paying out $25 million in response to first an audio deepfake, and then when he did what he was supposed to do, and he said, let's get on a call, and the people on the other end of the phone said, absolutely, and he, it turns out, hops on a video call, and they have a AI-generated image of, an AI-generated avatar, sort of like a face swap, and he thinks he is doing what he's supposed to do with the check. And it turns out that piece is also deep faked. So he winds up wiring $25 million. So again, the question of like, is there impact? The answer is quite demonstrably yes. And we shouldn't be focusing exclusively on the realm of the political because this stuff is really happening. And it's happening, I would argue, even more importantly, to ordinary people. Again, in the paper that we wrote, we kind of go into just how big this, the view counts and engagement on this stuff is. That pretty kitchen over there, which doesn't exist, received about 40 million views and 2 million reactions, right? So some of the content is actually making its way quite up high, and it's happening because the recommender systems are pushing it out. So you are seeing these sort of like fake sites that are telling you stay in my Airbnb log cabin that doesn't exist, but the way that that content is reaching people is that the platform recommender system is promoting it. In the realm of NCII, just sort of switching focus to the other type of harm, one of the things that is happening are the Undress Me apps. And again, that's having pretty profound implications as this is explicitly illegal. Oftentimes people who are using these apps are not aware that it is explicitly illegal. But again, what happens is the content that is sometimes made because people think it's a joke escapes, lands on the internet, and then the victim, the target, has to spend a ton of time trying to figure out what happens when that has happened. The laws have not caught up here. And again, this is another impact that is happening, but because it's happening to women and girls and teenagers, even though women and girls and teenagers have been warning about this since around 2017, it's only now that you're starting to see lawmakers pay attention to it. This is just a glimpse into like how sophisticated things have actually gotten. With relative ease, you can participate in communities online like Civet AI, where you can participate in the development of ever more realistic content. So this is far beyond at this point the kind of stuff that you would get out of a platform that tries to maintain some control. For example, like OpenAI, Google, Facebook, Meta, the companies that care about being compliant try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. They try to prevent certain types of content from being created, but with relative ease, using open source models, you can in fact create it. So we still find ourselves in the question of what do you do about it? And this is another aspect for fine-tuning content and output, low-rank adaptations or LoRAs. In this particular case, you can see a generated image, the woman on the left. The LoRA requests that the person in this case be made to look more like Audrey Hepburn. And then the other LoRA in the far end image there is aging it down. So you can envision what these things are used for. They have legitimate uses. People use them trying to create images and the likenesses of their favorite celebrity. I personally think that's still problematic, but here we are. But and then the aging down ones are because some models will try to resist producing child outputs, and so there are now entire communities that are dedicated to making sure that that you can in fact do that. This is, of course, that particular image is not, but you can imagine what is happening. There have now been several arrests, and we are now waiting to see how the law catches up to prosecutions around this type of the more explicit aspects of this content. And then finally, just it gets easier and easier. So in painting is what is used to kind of draw some glasses on that generated image. The glasses are rendered. That last one over there is a Pixel phone, the new Google Pixel. It's called Reimagine, where that was an image of a woman sitting on the floor, and you ask the app to reimagine. This is on your phone. This is not even something you need an open source model or sophisticated processing power for. You ask it to add in the sort of accoutrements over there on the right. So these are areas where, again, this is not political content. This is not propaganda. These are the sorts of things that it is becoming used for in other aspects. And what we see, again, is we see incredible degrees of innovation among different adversarial actor types. And so one of the things that we sort of beat the drum on here is that when people are studying disinformation or propaganda, it is actually very, very worthwhile to look at what these different adversarial actor types are doing, in fact, and not to limit yourself to thinking in terms of the political. And I will stop there.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, guys. Just getting this set up here.
Did we lose that? Oh.
There we go. So, it's clearly there's a lot of problems out there in the digital world with the use of AI for all sorts of nefarious purposes. I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about an initiative that offers a little bit of optimism, a little bit of light. And this is the Content Authenticity Initiative that Adobe kicked off in late 2019, really in response to these mis and disinformation, hyper-realistic images. And because Adobe plays in the technology space, obviously, and makes a lot of very powerful software, we wanted to get ahead of this by providing some solutions that would benefit everybody, not just Adobe. So pretty much everything you're about to see is open source, which is to say that anybody and everybody could use it. Since inception, the community has grown to over 3,000 members. This is sort of a representative look at some of the bigger players. As you can see, it's a who's who of news media companies, hardware, software, advertising, social media, etc. And it's indicative of the general digital interest around addressing the problems of mis and disinformation and misleading AI, etc. We took a look at the landscape to start. Detection was the first thing we looked at, which involves uploading suspect files to programs that look for telltale signs of manipulation. Detection is useful on an ad hoc basis, certainly, but has some limitations. It's not particularly scalable, it's not particularly accurate, and it's invariably an arms race with bad actors trying to stay one step ahead of the latest detection software. So instead, we're focused in on three other areas. Policy, which involves briefing policymakers around the world so that legislation that's currently being enacted around the world is based on the deep understanding of the status quo and what's coming down the road. Education, which involves media literacy in the classroom, as well as societal awareness, and also consumer education around new technologies like the ones that you're about to see. But the focus here is on this notion of provenance, which is a term that some of you might be familiar with from the art world, the provenance of a painting, who owned it before, where did it come from, etc. In this case, provenance really refers to the basic facts about the origins of a piece of digital content. Where did it come from? How might it have been manipulated along its journey? And then sharing some or all of that information with the viewer. And so when we think about provenance, it's really about calling things what they are, as opposed to detecting what's false. And the journey is an interesting one thus far. We started off with creators around attribution, news media companies around trust, generative AI companies around transparency, but more recently, corporations interested in protecting their brands or consumer protection, insurance companies, and a whole host of other examples that you can see here, which really tell us that here we are in 2024, And there's pretty much zero empirical evidence about the origins of anything that we see online. And if you add to that the effect of generative AI, where anything can be faked, and what we call the sort of liar's dividend, if one thing can be fake, then everything can presumably be fake. So we think that provenance is going to become something foundational across the digital world in the coming years, as organizations and companies and individuals who have a vested interest in displaying the veracity or the integrity of what they're publishing becomes more and more important. So how do we get there? I'm going to introduce a technology called content credentials. This comes from an underlying standards organization that I'll get to in a minute. But essentially, it's like a digital nutrition label, in the same way that if you go to a supermarket, you can very quickly inspect the foodstuff and determine what's in it. Here you'll be able to inspect a piece of digital content and determine what's in it and where did it come from, so that you can make a better informed decision about how to interact with it. So to make this work, we've divided the work up into a number of areas, starting with capture. Here we're working with the hardware manufacturers, smartphones and cameras, to integrate this provenance technology into those devices at production, meaning that when you buy a camera or a smartphone, it'll come out of the box with this technology on it, and you as the user can choose to activate it or deactivate it, depending on what the default setting is. That allows you to empirically say, this particular file came from this particular camera or smartphone. We move on to editing, integrating this into editing programs so that you can understand the edit history of an image, what was done to it. We then move on to publishing, which involves maintaining the integrity of the content credential. And the reason that we're interested in that is because then we can display some or all of the information through the content credential, through that little CR icon that you see there, indicating that the content has underlying information. When we dig down a little bit deeper, as you can see here, we can get very granular in terms of the quantity and detail of information captured. But of course, recognizing that not everybody wants to share all of this information, and in some cases they probably shouldn't. Privacy concerns, security concerns, etc. So ultimately, all of this is customizable, and the user or the publisher can choose how much or how little information they're interested in sharing. So this pin here, this content credential logo, we want this to become as ubiquitous and as widely understood as, let's say, the copyright symbol or the Creative Commons symbol, indicating that a piece of content has underlying information. And if you're interested in understanding what that is, because you're confused or you have a doubt, you can interact with the content to see the provenance, to see where did it come from, see its origin. So the technology we use here is a combination of cryptographically secure metadata, not unlike the technology that you use for secure online banking. We bolster that with invisible watermarking, and we add what's called cloud-based fingerprinting, which is the comparison of the asset at hand with a thumbnail of the asset that we house on the cloud when we create the content credential. When we talk about AI, which is obviously the most urgent issue facing us right now, when we come across images like this of penguins in the desert that was created with Adobe's Firefly suite of products, we're then able to click on the content credential and expose, in this particular case, where the image came from. The good news is that both Adobe and OpenAI, who make a similar product called DALL-E 3, have now been routinely attaching content credentials to all of the content that those models generate, thus allowing for the subsequent display of that information to help us understand what it is we're looking at. Also on the video front, we've developed a player here, and as you can see here, this politician speaking to reporters. The line is blue until all of a sudden it goes red, indicating that there's something wrong with the video. Perhaps the audio was altered or something else was tampered with. So we're making good progress on the video front as well. We're also doing work in audio and in other formats. All of this technology comes from an underlying organization, as I mentioned, called the C2PA. This is an organization that sits within the Linux Foundation. It's a standards organization. Because it sits within the Linux Foundation, it means that the standard, the open standard that the C2PA has developed, is unencumbered by IP. Nobody owns it, which means anybody can use it, and that makes it very attractive. Those companies that you see there on the right are on the steering committee of the C2PA, but the group itself has grown to a little bit over 150 members, I think, at this stage. Adobe sits on the steering committee, chairs the technical working group, and a couple of years ago we released a version 1 of the specification. We're now on version 2.1. And it's really emerged as the most robust solution out there for provenance, to the extent that these companies have all indicated some level of implementation, which is encouraging. So the way then that we distinguish between the C2PA and the CAI is that the C2PA is, if you like, the architect's blueprint upon which everything is based, that open technical standard. And the Content Authenticity Initiative is a construction company building open source tools to accelerate implementation of the C2PA standard, as well as being a community of many thousands of members sharing best practices with the same goal of accelerating implementation. So we like to think about it as a movement aimed at spreading and implementing this underlying provenance standard. The camera companies are all coming along. Leica is already out the door as of a year ago with a production camera that you can buy. The other manufacturers are all coming along, as are the smartphone companies, so good progress there. And I'm going to end now with a short video that's going to show this technology in action. You'll see an image brought into Photoshop, heavily manipulated, published to a mocked-up social media site, and then you'll see how one interacts with it. So I start here in Photoshop. I enable content credentials, which is already available. I manipulate this image heavily, starting with the tonality of the image, cooling the temperature way down. And then I'm going to add some completely artificial clouds to the background using some AI. And then I'm going to overlay another image on top of this one. And lo and behold, I have an image purporting to show the pyramids in a blizzard. Hasn't happened yet, but maybe give it some time. Now I'm going to attach the content credential to this file, and imagine it pops up on a mocked-up social media site. I can click on the credential. That tells me it comes from Photoshop, but when I hit inspect, it takes me to the back end, and here I can see the family tree of the image, and using this little slider, I can see what did I start with and what did I end up with. So that's a functionality that will be on your computer and smartphone screens in the not too distant future. And then lastly, just underscore these 3 key pillars, because the technology will only get us so far. The technology being the provenance made up of those 3 elements that I described. But it's really important that we think about this in a unified way with the other pillars, which are education and policy. Because by doing that, 2 things happen. We elevate the conversation to the one of societal importance that I think it deserves, but we also create more entry points for people to engage, because technology in isolation is not to everybody's liking. However, when we incorporate education and policy, we create more entry points for people. And so that's really the initiative in a nutshell. If anybody is interested in this, they can join us. Membership is free. You can do it on a web form off of the website. We want to make the community as broad and as diverse as possible. So if you're interested, please consider it. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope it's on. That's good. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the fantastic points that you brought in. I'm going to start, but I'd love to hear from our audience. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. That's a class probably that ended. So there seems to be a conflict between the democratization of the tool and the preservation of our democracy. And as an artist, I'm very excited about that democratization that's happening and the access and the all these images that we are making. But what are not everybody obviously has the right intentions or the good intentions. And so what are some of the other solutions? We heard from Santiago, and the impact of provenance and the promise of provenance seems really wonderful. But what are some of the other solutions? Are there ways for us to mitigate the harm that especially you both talked about? Is it a lost cause? Is there hope? What are some of the thoughts? Oh, you were on, actually.
I was on.
Yeah.
I think we've over the years argued that policy, education, and design are the kind of three big areas. I think another aspect of it is really to just be aware of one of the areas with policy is what regulation can and can't do. There are certain areas where, for example, with the child safety stuff, you're seeing states begin to craft legislation to address it, and CII as well. With the spam and scams, like one clear argument is that that's not a policy problem, that's a platform should be doing more to simply catch it problem. But on the propaganda side, it becomes a challenge because one of the things that we see is that when it's created in the realm of propaganda, it falls under free expression. And so in that area, I do think it is creating mechanisms to help people understand that what they're seeing is, things like the content provenance and watermarking dynamics are some of the best tools out there to help people understand when they see the content that it is generated. We just don't see it as being foolproof, which is why the education piece matters so much.
Yeah. What about you, Sam?
I think drilling down on the policy piece, I guess what I'll say is I'm wary of solutions that only focus upon putting the burden of responding upon regular people who don't have a lot of time in their day, who didn't really create this problem. I guess society helped to create this problem in some ways, but really functionally the technology was scaled at a level, at a pace and at a level that none of us asked for. No one asked Facebook to reach 2 billion users, right? Or WhatsApp to reach that many users. And so, what do we do in terms of regulating these kinds of technologies? I think that there's a semi-genuine, it depends on the company. I think Adobe is very much genuine on this, but I think there's a semi-genuine call for policy, or there has been in the past by some of these entities. But I think the first thing that we have to do is implement some kind of campaign finance reform to look into the ways in which provenance occurs, who's doing these kinds of things for elected officials or for organizations, because right now we don't know. And what are the punishments for people when they do this stuff? There's not really punishments. The FEC right now, Federal Elections Commission, has a loophole called the subcontractor loophole, which functionally, if you're a political campaign, you can hire a contractor. So say you're a Democrat and you hire Blue State Digital to do your digital work for you. Then, Blue State Digital can hire a subcontractor that does things that might be a little less than savory, that never has to be reported to the FEC. The contractor must be reported, but the subcontractor never has to be reported. So when I go to look to try to figure out who it was that created this series of deep fakes and how much they got paid, or when a journalist at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal goes to do that, they can't. Something doesn't exist. And so there's a lot of problems with the way that our electoral law currently runs that makes this problematic. The FEC recently had a decision to make in December of last year to decide whether or not influencers who worked or who were paid by political campaigns to spread specific kinds of messages should have to disclose that they were paid by political campaigns. Do you know what the FEC did? Nothing. They didn't do anything. They decided not to. In the commercial space, you have to disclose when you are being paid by a commercial entity to advertise a specific product. That is a law or a regulation that comes down from the FTC, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so with the FEC's lack of movement in this space, I think there's a lot of concern. You're absolutely right that it comes down to a speech issue at face value, but really what it comes down to is a winner-take-all system that prioritizes wealthy organizations, individuals, super PACs that have the ability to try to circumvent these laws and to exert different kinds of control to get their content to trend, to get their content to the front page or to the first front page of the homepage of YouTube. And it results in a system that is not democratic. It's not actually free speech. It's using the language of democracy in an attempt to circumvent democracy itself. So I would say that some of the most obvious things are things like campaign finance reform and some of these other things.
That's really helpful. What? Yeah.
I see a little bit of movement in the legislative space in this country. First at the state level. In California, a number of bills were passed in the last week or so, specifically around the use of AI-generated materials for campaign material with consequences, well thought out. And I think what's happening at the federal level is it's just slower at the moment, particularly this year with everything that's going on. But there's a couple of bipartisan task forces, both in the Congress and in the Senate, do have some ideas as to how to proceed here. And I think they'll catch up, but I think the law is necessarily going to lag behind technology, especially technology like this, that is moving at warp speed. So I'm optimistic. I guess the question will be, by the time the law catches up, will the technology be another 5 miles down the road?
Yes.
And what happens then, right? And is it going to be a constant game of catch-up? Or is there going to be perhaps more courageous legislation that tries to get ahead of it? But to your point, there's lots of interest involved here.
I think it is going to have to come through the regulatory agencies. There's actually an open call for comment now from the FEC on campaign-produced content. Even that is something where they've been sort of punting, and this is in part because it is a much more divided body. It is harder to get them, get that agreement, and it is in fact that political polarization and the concerns about free expression that are leading to, again, or at least the nods to the concept of free expression, which I think is legitimate in some cases and less legitimate in others. It is going to prevent it from passing through the Senate as well. It's ultimately going to be something that's going to happen piecemeal by the states.
I also think that the thing that with state responses is, I don't know if I'm on or not. I think the thing with state responses is that I wrote a piece with the former chairwoman of the FEC, Anne Ravel, a while back, and what Anne and I said in the piece with a colleague, Hansini Sridharan, is that this kind of balkanized approach, forgive the metaphor, to creating legislation actually ends up in a system where you have some states like California which create quite good laws, or reasonably good. Renee and I know we both consulted on some of these things, and yeah, it never ends up like Frankenstein a bit. But anyway, when you have states like California who create semi-decent laws, then you have other states who actually weaponize the law against efforts to do things like support the get out the vote campaigns that are so critical to democracy. And so depending upon the state and the kind of law that they could, you saw this with the TikTok bans recently, depending upon the state, the motivations for creating a ban or for creating a reason to do something in this regard can be very, very different. And so you really got to read between the lines.
Yeah, and it's also an international issue as well,
yes,
right?
Right.
Like it's not just our legislation. I'm going to open. We have 2 mics, and I see Siva and can we please pass the mics? Who do you have? Thank you. There's Siva, and then thank you.
I think while that's happening, I'll just note that the Europeans continue to pass laws on these things, even as the U.S. does not, which leads to interesting dynamics whereby platforms and creation tools will be subject to European regulations, and so you will see that de facto impact the American experience as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yes, please.
So, I'm somewhat optimistic about the notion of intervention through authenticity, markers of authenticity, watermarks, and so forth. Oh, there we go. All right, sorry. I'm optimistic about the idea that markers of authenticity, watermarking, and so forth can make some difference in, perhaps put some friction in the system for slowing the distribution of this sort of propaganda, at least giving journalists, in many cases, an opportunity to dig through, if not everyday use, right, and see whether a piece of content is authentic or not. And I can imagine that because of your various partnerships, this is going to work very well on a platform like YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. What I worry about is, one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that if you go back 20 years, when it was a much nicer time in the world, and we thought that the biggest meltdown created by digitization and distribution was going to be that the copyright system would fall apart, if only, that were what was at stake. And in fact, these markers of authenticity, watermarking, detection, computer-based detection, made a huge difference in stabilizing that system and sort of preventing a complete meltdown, often changing norms and practices. But when we're talking about the real-world harms that both Sam and Renee have pointed out, my mind is immediately going to WhatsApp groups in Lebanon, where we are unlikely to have either any sort of regulation or any sort of education You're not likely to see that in Pakistan, where the government has no interest in either of those things. You're unlikely to see it in Indonesia. And so those other two pillars are just largely hopeless in much of the world. And I would actually argue largely hopeless in the United States too, for other reasons. In the absence of that, I wonder whether there is a way to count on an environment like a WhatsApp group where content doesn't sit the same way it does on YouTube, or it doesn't sit the same way it does on Instagram, and therefore doesn't necessarily have the same back-end embeddedness. And I know that's sort of a technological question, but that's I think where the real problem is now, and probably where attention should be most focused, where there's the biggest chance for damage. And I've been following people who are active in WhatsApp groups in Lebanon, and it's incredibly difficult right now. Like an incredible flurry of nonsense and misinformation in an environment and a moment that could not be more stressful, right? And so that's where we're actually going to see real human harm with the distribution of this sort of propaganda. So that's my biggest concern. Is there any sense that the industries are thinking about environments beyond North America?
I think it's a global concern. It's not limited to one geography. But it's a process because the lift is very heavy. You're not only introducing technologies that allow for an understanding of the origins of digital files, you're really striving to some degree, modify the way people interact with content, whether it's to be skeptical about the origins of content in a way that I would argue has slipped significantly in the last 20 or 30 years, perhaps. And there is also, of course, the policy component. You know, one of the things that I think might be a driver towards implementation around the world, the WhatsApp thing is a point well taken, and that's a whole nother ecosystem, but one thing at a time, is the role that advertisers and advertising agencies are starting to play in all of this. The world's advertising industry is controlled by about a half a dozen major holding companies, WPP, Omnicom, Publicis, etc. They're very interested in provenance technologies because they're interested in ensuring that the ads that they manufacture for their customers are placed alongside content that has some level of legitimacy. And because there's so much money involved in the advertising world, and because the advertising world underpins to some degree the news media world, it could well be that that becomes the global catalyst, at least on a commercial level, as we see in the news media and on other social platforms. I think the point about the WhatsApp ecosystem is interesting because now increasingly you're seeing news media companies creating or feeding content into WhatsApp groups because they're having a hard time reaching their customers who no longer flock to news websites in the way that they once did. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But it's complicated, and it's not going to happen overnight. And of course, as we know, the technology races ahead. The law follows some distance behind. I think leadership is really important in this, and there are leaders in each of these segments, whether it's social media or advertising or news media or other industries who do have a more holistic vision of things. And if you get that sort of confluence of leadership with opportunity and resources, those things could well serve us better.
So it's something of a shameless plug, but I have a book coming out soon called Encrypted Propaganda with Chicago, and it's all about this stuff. So it's about the ways in which encrypted environments, WhatsApp in particular, but we discussed Telegram, Line, Signal, and a few others, are leveraged for the purpose of manipulation. We wrote a paper a while back with a Lebanese grad student for Misinfo Review on voice notes in Lebanon, and it's not, given the current context, things are very different, but what we showed in Lebanon was that over these applications, that voice notes that were shared that we sourced, we got over 60 of them that were fake. had a tremendous impact upon particular communities, particularly women, journalists, activists, people on the ground. What we show, in terms of the response, the capacity for response on an encrypted application like WhatsApp, which, for those of you that don't use it, it has over 2 billion users around the world. Some people would argue that encrypted messaging services or services that offer some level of encryption, which we can't see into by design, are actually the most popular, for communication around the world at this stage. But we don't have good data on it because they don't share that content with us. We know it's in the billions and billions. What I would say, Siva, is that community-based responses are going to be more important than ever. And it's not to pass the buck, but it is to say that we see a lot of people already, in the diaspora communities across the United States, for instance, just to use a US example, that this is happening around the world. We see them building their own internal capacity over the last 6, 7, 8 years within WhatsApp channels to respond to disinformation that's targeted at their community. We see it, for instance, in the Chinese American community in Houston in a big way, in the Indian American community in North Carolina. And it's amazing what these folks are able to do, speaking a particular language and speaking a particular cultural vernacular in order to fact check these kinds of things. What I would hugely advocate for, and I have a piece coming out soon in CIGI, which basically says, we need to invest in the communities that are already combating this rather than helicoptering in, our own educational programs that are supposed to be one size fits all. Because as some of you might know, Dana Boyd made this argument that media literacy really backfires when you attempt to take a one size fits all media literacy effort and you give it to someone who's already an extremist. You end up actually entrenching them in their belief rather than actually helping them. So unless you're speaking the person's language culturally and linguistically, in these kinds of environments, what we're talking about here, the solutions that we're talking about maybe won't work.
Yes, thank you. Major Fabiani Duarte. I'm one of the professors at the JAG School here with my colleague, Major Kemelik. I'm Air Force, she's Army. You can ask us later who's better. But
thank you for your service.
No, thank y'all for a wonderful conversation. We talk about AI a lot over there with our JAGs. And we talk a lot about what you discussed, ma'am, about the EU AI Act, and also looking at our pacing competitor in the People's Republic of China, who's also been developing these piecemeal AI legislations, deep synthesis legislation with watermarks, provenance, all these things. Looking competitively to those partners and competitors, are there any lessons from their models that y'all think we can bring into our policy development? You've talked about watermarking. Is there anything else from their approaches? I think the EU AI Act finally will go into effect in 2025 after this year of passage and preparation. So just some thoughts.
I think there's at least in Europe with the AI Act, there was a greater sense of urgency and commitment to get something done. I think here in this country, the states are well ahead of the federal government. I was in Washington this spring briefing a congressional AI task force. Pure education, closed door, no cameras. And there was a real hunger from these legislators, I think 24 on this particular task force, bipartisan, well represented. There was a real hunger among most of them to learn. A few of them had computer science or mathematical backgrounds, so they understood what we were talking about when it came to provenance and some of these technologies. But the majority of those representatives really didn't understand and were, I would say, half educated, if that. They might have read a newspaper article, or their staffs might have read a newspaper article, and the buzzword was watermarking, not understanding the nuance. And I think part of the challenge at the political level is to take this highly complex technology and translate it into an accessible vernacular, into understandable language that legislators can then use to craft legislation that is meaningful and accurate. And that's quite a challenge because it bumps up against the need often for political messaging to be simple. And so you're taking something complex, you're trying to simplify it while maintaining its accuracy, and then they are often requesting it to be further simplified because of the nature of politics. So there's a lot of work to be done, but getting back to what I was talking about before, I think that you need to look at the areas of technology, education, and policy holistically. And it's super important, but it needs to be done in a way that, when we talk about media literacy is not in very many, if any, curricula, certainly in this country. Educators are resource strapped, they are time constrained, their students are constantly shifting the way that information is consumed. So you create, as we did last year, very robust curricular material for use in the classroom for media literacy. And the feedback we got from educators is, no, it needs to be in bite-sized chunks. It needs to be something that I can very quickly show to a group of students and use as the basis for discussion. So I think that those three areas are intertwined.
Renee, you want to respond?
We should exchange information. I'd love to follow up on this. One of the things that we've seen from China is they have begun to actually enforce and kind of prosecute under some of their legal frameworks. But again, they have a very, very different set of things, of types of outputs that they can turn into a problem in a way that we don't here, right? And so there is just a difference in... Oh, am I not on? Sorry.
Yeah, just put it on green. Thank you.
I hope you heard that. Okay. So I think in that regard, like, there is no arguments about the right to free expression justifying your ability to create an image of somebody doing a thing they didn't do. It's a foundationally different set of laws that they are going to pass, and so, we sort of followed the fact that they are choosing to enforce with some interest. Kind of curious to see where they were going to go with that. I think they've gone after some of the scammers as well, again, for manipulation and products that don't exist. So they've been very, very forceful with those things. Europe's just been interesting because, again, much like the Digital Services Act, they've shown a willingness to be proactive. This doesn't necessarily translate to the most to creating regulation that does the most effective thing. Meaning that goes after, there's some feasibility problems in European regulations in terms of what is technically possible and what actually makes a difference. I don't know if you followed some of the stuff on model auditing and things along these lines, where it's an interesting area of focus and they're creating requirements around it, but it's so new and we haven't really seen if it's going to actually have any real impact yet.
Can I just say two quick things? So the thing that came to mind as you were speaking was, I know that privacy expert Bruce Schneier did some work on thinking through like the media ecosystems of authoritarian countries versus democracies vis-a-vis privacy and protection of online users. And they talked about the threat space. They talk about the threat space a lot. So if you get my email, I'll share that with you. But one of the arguments they make is that the trust in the ecosystem, trust in air quotes, I think, like in a democracy looks a lot different because we have a pluralistic or semi-pluralistic media environment in the United States where sure, it's 6 massive conglomerates that control most of the media, but it's still, there's a lot of disagreement about who's doing what, when, and how. We even disagree in this country about who is actually the president. And in authoritarian countries, that's simply not allowed. The media ecosystems are fundamentally and thoroughly controlled, and so that has a very different implications for how policy plays out in these spaces. The second thing I would say is that when it comes to creating policy in the United States, we have to consider, the small p politics of our country. Of course, everyone knows that polarization is at an all-time high right now, and anything can happen in November with our election in the nature of a democracy. But I think we have to find areas where Republicans and Democrats can agree. I think that national security tends to be one of them, usually. It used to be, at least, not so much anymore, maybe. But CSAM, for instance, child sexual abuse material, some of these things, also commercial legislation that holds people accountable for, like we said, the FTC has been much more willing to act. And I kind of think of this like the Al Capone effect. If you can create mechanism by which you catch these folks committing financial crimes or doing some of these other sorts of things, and you can get Republicans and Democrats to agree that that's a problem and create law that gets them that way, then that's how you bring down Al Capone in the propaganda space. You don't get him because he murdered a bunch of people, you get him because he didn't file his taxes, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about this, because I think there's simply no way we'll see the kind of agreement that we see in the EU Parliament, or that we have seen in the EU Parliament.
Maybe we have time for one more question from our great audience.
I have what may be a low-level practical question about the provenance strategy. Is there any way to sort of backwards engineer existing material to add this stuff? If it wasn't there when you first took the photo, can you put it in?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work in the archival space to retrofit content credentials to existing archival collections, or to when things get digitized as they begin their digital journey. So there's a definite sort of backwards-looking component to this. We've been talking with NASA, for example. They have a massive collection of imagery from space, both still and video, and they're very interested in establishing the provenance of that collection. So there is a way to do that. We've been focused on the forward-looking stuff most recently, but now we're starting to look at the archival stuff. And from a technological standpoint, it's definitely possible.
Thank you very much. Great, wonderful, thank you. I'd like to really thank all our distinguished panelists here with bringing all these great ideas for us. So let's give them another round of applause. Just